This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Yes, well, I was saying I think everybody will have said what I'm going to say by the time it comes to me. And what I'm going to do is really just give you an overview of our report that we've brought out and a few of the recommendations, all of which, in terms of the recommendations, at least you've heard before. But I think it's probably a good sign, isn't it, that what you're going to hear me say now at the end is a wrap-up of what we've been hearing all throughout the day, because hopefully that says that the report is reflecting really what's out there. Okay, so the report itself basically outlines how in the last 50 years of the conflict in Colombia, we've seen an accumulation of land as one of the strategic objects behind this conflict. And that the Colombian people have experienced a humanitarian crisis which you've only heard a part of, I think, today, the extent of which probably is best portrayed in the numbers of people that have been forcibly displaced. And that's approximately 5.2 million people by the end of 2010. And we were in Scotland recently, and they told me that was the whole of the population of Scotland. So that's just to give you some kind of idea about what people have suffered. There are varying figures regarding the amount of land that's been usurped or stolen from people. They begin with about 3.5 million hectares and they go up to 6.6 million hectares. And mining and hydrocarbons have also played a part in the displacement of communities. It's often violated their right to consultation and consent processes, as we've heard. And those defending their rights and the rights of their communities have often been killed, disappeared, threatened, harassed, and subject to arbitrary detention and prosecution. One of the objectives of the accumulation of land, according to various special rapporteurs, which started back as far as 2000 with Francis Dane, was that the accumulation of land was to benefit large landowners and for the development of mega projects, which included agro-industry, infrastructure, and extractives. Money from the cultivation of drugs and drug trafficking has also been used to fund and often fuel conflict in Colombia. And the peasant farmers, indigenous peoples, and Afro-Colombians have seen their lands taken over, as Alex explained, in terms of the cultivation of drugs, agro-industry, and are often destroyed both by the aerial fumigation as well as the processing of the drugs themselves. Mining has played a part of the panorama in Colombia up till now, but the reason which I mentioned at the beginning of this conference as to why we've done this report on mining is because the government's recent plans to roll out a massive program on mining, which is aimed at tripling the area of mining in the country by 2021, have caused serious alarm amongst the partners that we have out there. And most of them have been calling attention to this over the last few years. But all I have to say is that what we found when we started looking into the problems of mining is it wasn't just the communities that were calling or sounding the alarm. It's also been several government officials and government ministers as well who've been stating that they're particularly concerned about what's happening, about the pervasiveness and the level of the extent of the expansion of the mining program. Sandra Morelli, who's the Comptroller General, she called attention to the fact that Colombia was heading, she said, for the worst environmental disaster that in its history. And so she was particularly calling attention at that time to what might be the results of the amount of water and the contamination of water that mining was using, and also their advance into areas of ecological fragile ecosystems. And the Minister for Agriculture called attention to the fact that mining was going to be going into a lot of the areas that were cultivating for food, etc. And I think Robert referred to this earlier on. And he said that there should be some no-go areas for mining, some areas that should be kept specifically for agricultural production. Sandra Morelli also drew attention to the fact in her most recent report that 59% of Colombian territory is either under concession or has applications pending for mining concessions. And this is a considerable amount of the territory. In the light of all these concerns, one would have thought that the government needs to focus on strengthening things like the free, prior and informed consent processes. But unfortunately, in looking at some of the changes that are coming about with the mining code, what it's actually done is weaken those processes. So, for example, it appears from the language that they're using in the law in regards to strategic mining areas, which are basically areas which are declared by the government as strategic for mining. They're then parceled up into smaller areas and they're auctioned off to multinational corporations. The free, prior and informed consent process for this only happens once the multinational corporation has signed the contract with the government. And so this could actually end up circumventing, really, because it's not clear what rights the communities are going to have in that case once they've actually signed the contract. And the same thing in terms of these strategic mining areas are in often ecologically friendly, ecological fragile systems. So, for example, in Amazonias, Orinoquia, Chocó, all of these areas where you find rainforest, strategic mining areas have been declared there. So concerned was the Minister for the Environment, but I think also because of immense pressure from local groups, that he took out a resolution just before he left office, which has actually stopped the mining in Amazonias or halted it, suspended it for 2 years whilst they take a look at it. But these are some of the worrying things that are actually, instead of strengthening the mechanisms when you've got a program of this extent, what's been happening is that the mechanisms are being weakened. And Andy Whitmore also referred to the different decisions in the Colombian Constitutional Court, which have been going in the opposite direction of actually strengthening the consent processes. So how these two things are going to be brought together is going to be interesting to see in Colombia. On the pro side of arguing for mining, obviously we've heard several of the arguments about the investments in terms of social programs, etc., and the revenue that this is going to bring into countries to actually help with the development, which the ambassador quite clearly outlined in his speech. However, when we started to do this report, we started talking to various economists in Colombia, and one of them, Guillermo Ruedas, has been employed by the National Planning Department of the Colombian government to look into the situation of tax exemptions. And it's a particularly worrying situation in Colombia, which is detailed in this report, because what he discovered was the tax exemptions were extremely high, particularly in the area of coal. And in the area of coal, the tax exemptions that countries received were around about 53% one year, and it had gone up to just over 60% the next year. But when you added in the tax relief that they got on fuel, it appears that the Colombian government in the years 2007 and 2009 were actually paying the corporations to take the coal. And that's particularly worrying if you're saying that one of the major areas of or positive sides of mining is to bring in revenue. That doesn't appear to be happening in Colombia in terms of what the government is actually giving back to corporations. And just to sort of give you an idea of the level of exemptions, in 2009, to mineral and hydrocarbon companies, they totaled 3.82 billion. And if you then think about the fact that Colombia has planned to spend in this year on the victims of the conflict 2.9 billion. That's considerably less than what they're giving back to multinational mining corporations. So I just move on now and take a look at some of the recommendations that we make in the report. The point that we make in the report is that whilst voluntary measures and principles such as corporate social responsibility and the Ruggie principles, etc., are essential for guiding companies, and that actually many of these principles have served to raise standards due to their role in pushing incremental improvements, a major negative impact that we see has been that of undermining attempts to develop effective legal sanction, both at a national and international level, without which it can be seen that from many of the case studies today, it's not possible to prevent companies from abusing the rights of local communities. Ruggie himself talks about the evidence of an expanding web of potential corporate liability for international crime. And this is in the context of developed and developing voluntary principles. In the conclusion to his report, he stresses that the most consequential legal development in business and human rights is the gradual extension of liability to companies for international crime under domestic jurisdiction, but reflecting international standards. In some circumstances, companies can already be held liable for offences overseas. For example, the UK has recently expanded its extraterritorial jurisdiction to include holding companies liable for bribery offences committed outside the UK. Of course, Alan's covered all of that. What we're particularly hopeful, although Tom's already said it's not likely to do, was that the business and human rights strategy would consider some of these aspects in terms of covering human rights impacts on communities like Indigenous communities. And one of the things that made us hopeful that, I suppose one of the things that is hopeful at least, is that the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, in a report recently, stated just in September of this year, that while guidance and voluntary initiatives are undoubtedly worthwhile, they do not on their own meet the spirit of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which envisage that states will take appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, punish, redress abuses through effective policies, legislation, regulation, and adjudication. And they go on to say that as part of the duty to protect human rights, it should consider an extension of extraterritorial jurisdiction to cover actions overseas by businesses based in the UK or by firms operating under contract to the UK. And a criterion that was engaged deciding whether or not to apply extraterritorial jurisdiction to the arms trade, for example, was where it appears to be in the interest and the standing of the reputation of the UK and the international community. The standing and reputation of the UK is undoubtedly affected by unprosecuted violations of human rights by its companies overseas. They also recognised in the Foreign Affairs Select Committee that relying on local administration of justice might not be enough to preserve the international reputation of the UK for holding up high standards of human rights. Given these statements, I hope that we will see in the future that there is certainly a stronger legislation to try to hold companies to account. Now, other things that are recommended in this report are transparency of reporting and information, which we've heard an awful lot on today, and I'm going to finish in just 2 seconds. So that's one area, and we also cover this about the area that Miles has been talking about in terms of greater accountability for all companies listed on the London Stock Exchange. Those are mostly the UK recommendations, but there's quite a few for both the European Union and also for the Colombian government itself. But I hope that you will take the report away and that you will read it. And if anybody wants to sign up for an electronic copy, if we've run out, you can sign up for that.